I'm super excited to be here with the Top Coder community. And as you mentioned, we'll be going over, getting the gig. I'm adding a little bit of a different flavor to this presentation because I'll be kind of talking about it from my perspective. And really the theming is around how to make the most out of the experience. So, we'll actually kind of move away from sort of the job search piece and really touch on, portions around things to look at as we're interviewing all the way through thinking about, the next couple of years, right? That way you're best equipped to make really thoughtful and purposeful decisions as you're advancing your career, right? I like to sort of say, let's frame it in a way that we can actually be more proactive than reactive. So let me go ahead and pull up my slide for you all so we can kind of get started on that. And yeah, I see a few people chime in where they're joining from. So we've got folks from Indonesia. Ooh, actually here, let me see something. There is a way for me to, maybe there isn't. So I won't be able to see the chat, unfortunately. So I'll try to chime in, but so far I saw Indonesia and Budapest. So that's amazing. I'm actually located in the Silicon Valley, in San Jose to be exact, which is about 45 minutes south of San Francisco. And before we get started, I just want to go a little bit into this overview, right? As I mentioned before, in summary, it's practical tips that you can apply to your job search and how to make most of your role. So these are things that you can apply tomorrow, okay? Before you sort of get in depth with that, here's just a general agenda, right? So I'll provide a little bit of an introduction about myself, and then I'll talk about, my story building a design team. Then we'll go over getting into the door and how to make the most of it, right? I'm going to be looking at these sort of things in sort of different phases. So that'll be the flavor that we'll approach this. So a little bit about me. I have stuff on the screen. You can read that if you please. But as Jesse mentioned, I'm a manager at LinkedIn. I've been there for about 3 years. I want to give you a little bit of perspective and an idea of how I sort of got there. I started out pretty young. When I was in, middle school, that was when I had my first job. It was actually developing a website for my mom's school. And it was really just a passion project, and eventually, I started to really kind of get into graphic design, and there I was able to sort of merge the two between like the coding piece as well as the design piece. Throughout these years, though, the industry was changing and transforming quite a bit. UX really wasn't a term. There weren't too many amazing resources like Top Coder to really engage with the community, and also a ton of great content. So there's a lot of wayfinding. And I think one of the standout things for me is, I let that passion and that curiosity really kind of fuel, which gave me a little bit more clarity in terms of what things could look like. So my first job in UX was actually being a design manager at a company called Base CRM located in Chicago. And it was tough. I really didn't have the UX vernacular. I'd never worked with engineering team at that point. And so it was a lot of learning on the job and learning fast and wearing multiple hats. But I think from those learnings, it also fueled growth, right? I saw opportunities for improvement. And eventually I was tasked to grow that design team. Was it something I expected? No. However, it was an opportunity to really kind of think of a vision in terms of how I could see a team sort of grow. And I had an idea of what it could look like, but in the end, it totally manifests itself different than what I expected, right? Whether it be building a recruiting pipeline all the way to creating an interview process, to actually coaching and mentoring a design team and growing that team as well to be more effective and gain more influence within our product strategy. There's a lot there, right? And I'm not even talking about my own sort of career growth, right? And so as I started to, get into that role a little bit more, I realized that I need to have a little bit more foundational learning around what it meant to really be an effective manager, but then also be able to manage at scale, right? As a manager, you're not actually designing work anymore. If anything, you're sort of empowering your team to really drive that vision. And so when I got to LinkedIn, there's a ton of amazing support from a management perspective. There's a lot of career growth. And today I'm managing around 7 designers across the United States. Well, I mean, we're all remotely now. You know, I'm working on our enterprise product called LinkedIn Marketing Solutions, which connects our, you know, our customers to our more than 700 million users around the globe. So our tools are very diverse in nature, whether it be from consumer experiences on the feed, all the way to supporting, you know, advertisers to, you know, create and launch campaigns, as well as be able to sort of look at reporting and see how those campaigns are performing. So that's a bit about background. You know, if there's any sort of questions that kind of come up or that come to mind, more than happy to kind of dive in as we get towards the Q&A portion of the presentation. So as I mentioned before, you know, we'll be looking at this in the perspective of a 2-year journey. So we're gonna start from year 0, and that's sort of at the interview stage, okay? Oops, 1 second guys, sorry. So that's at the interview stage. When we get into year 2 or year 1, kind of think about that as sort of settling in, right? So how can you really make the most of being in that environment? There's a lot of things that you can do. So I've actually split that into, you know, your first 6 months and your second 6 months of the year. And then year 2, it's thinking about making impact, right? The reason that I really sort of did this 2-year approach on this presentation is, you know, with the designers that I have, I've managed probably more than 20 designers. And so one of the things that I constantly sort of see is that the light bulb really strikes, you know, in that second year, right? I think the first year, it's really sort of getting to know folks, getting comfortable, looking at, you know, understanding sort of like the marketplace and building relationships. I think once you start to establish that trust, then you start to look at more opportunities and you understand sort of ways that you can start to leverage, you know, the resources and your partners to really make things happen. All right. So within these different pieces, I'll kind of dive into a bit about, you know, I'll kind of voice over a little bit more in terms of what are the things that you can do more tactically to take the best advantage of that situation. And so we'll get into year 0, the interview. And so there's really, you know, there's really sort of like 3 things I want to talk about. It's embracing your superpower. Explain the why behind your design decision or decisions in any process. I know this is a, you know, a mixed crowd of folks, but a lot of these things can actually be applied to any, you know, any sort of vertical. And then the last piece is embracing the community. And this is something that I think is actually more, you know, it stands out more now that we're working remotely and we're still globally connected. So how can we embrace the community, even though sort of the mediums have changed since we're not meeting in person? Oops, let me go back. So again, when it comes to embracing your superpower, you know, when you're getting into a new job, a lot of times it can be actually transitioning, they're pivoting into a new career. I've met with folks that have had backgrounds in marketing, biotechnology. You know, I've also seen people in the travel industry pivot their careers into user experience. And one of the things that tends to happen is that people like to sort of say, you know, that's behind, you know, what we're going to shove my past into a closet because now I'm a designer, I'm an engineer. But in actuality, it's best to actually embrace that background of yours. And the reason that I say that is it's important to just really kind of develop, you know, what I kind of call either a 10-second pitch or a minute pitch about yourself. it's one of those things, I think, when you're working on your case study, it's great to have it in a case study. And then additionally, if you're actually having an on-site interview, being able to talk about yourself, I think that's probably a story that you can confidently tell. And so there's an opportunity to really show the real you. Okay. So I would challenge you all to really kind of think about, how your background can kind of, really provide, an opportunity for the business to have sort of, a good depth of knowledge, even though you're not necessarily working in that. So I'll give you a great example. There was a woman that I was mentoring for a while, and she had, as I mentioned before, transitioned from biotechnology into UX design. And so it's pretty hard to kind of draw the connection there, right? But as we started to talk a little bit more, at the basis of the work that she was doing is a scientific process, right? You hypothesize, you experiment, and that's a core part of being an effective user experience designer. And so having that sort of experience and that background and applying it, in my opinion, really helped her stand out. Okay, so really kind of think a little bit more about that. The next piece is explain the why behind your design decisions or your decisions in general. There's a lot of content online, and a lot of it's sort of, there's a lot of hyperbole, right? It's sort of how to make the best portfolio, or how to sort of, maybe the portfolio needs to be short, or maybe it's too long. But I think importantly, it's important to talk about the why behind your design decisions or your decisions at all, because again, that is providing your lens. Your portfolio, your representation online is in fact the first opportunity to present yourself. And I think the more effectively you can communicate, the more chances you have of actually getting that call to come in for an interview, right? An additional piece of that is that's actually not going to go away. And so think of it in your case study as practice. I work with a number of different cross-functional partners, and I have a lot of great ideas, and so does my team, but they're not effective if we cannot actually tell people how we got to our conclusions, right? So, most of what we do, there's some sort of constraint that we're working under. And so the real thing is sort of being able to communicate based on that, why you thought one methodology was the best over another. That shows your expertise, and it also shows your reasoning. And this is one I think is really important, right? Embracing the community. There's a lot of questions in terms of how do I network, right? A lot of folks have been laid off. A lot of folks have graduated from school. A lot of folks are pivoting, and there's not necessarily a job on the other side of it. But there's something very important about networking, right? And networking, it's all about who you know. I work at LinkedIn, and building connections is a really, important part of the experience, right? Because it can lead to more opportunities. It can lead to more knowledge share. It can lead to more jobs potentially. And so, I think being able to have an ongoing conversation with your community is important, because even though you may not have something that, that may manifest itself tomorrow, over a strong relationship over time, it may open doors, right? And so how can you do that? So for one, a lot of folks are starting to do, online one-on-one mentoring sessions. So really start to look for those opportunities. Because folks are making themselves way more available. Tons of websites out there for that. There are also a lot of great content, right? So a webinar like this, really kind of connect with the folks that are joining. That's going to be something that, a lot of folks tend to kind of look over. So connect with folks in the chat. And then additionally too, there's online conferences that are happening at a subsidized price than if they were actually in person, right? You don't have to worry about travel. You don't have to worry about lodging. So really kind of take advantage of that. Just take another angle. Even though things aren't the same, there are more opportunities to connect with folks. So really embrace the community, because a lot of them have really mobilized online. All right, so we're gonna get into year one, right? And the way that I really like to frame this is that you finally sort of made it, right? You've gone through sending out, I don't know how many resumes, applying for jobs. Some you may have heard from, some you haven't. And I think at this point, you're like, all right, now I can prepare for this job. But a lot of times you're waiting on the employer sort of to sort of drive that. And that's not going to be the case every single time. One of the things that I like to really kind of tell my designers is that, you know, they are actually responsible for their growth. I, as a manager, help facilitate that. Okay. And so we'll kind of go through some of these things. I think most importantly, when it comes to you know, getting into a gig like this, it's going to be important to really be your authentic self, right? And I know a lot of folks have heard so many definitions of what it means to be authentic. That definition is up to you, because that is ultimately a feeling that you will have. But you know, I have a strong belief that team culture won't advance until the team is collectively able to bring their authentic self to work every single day, right? And so it's really about establishing connection. And there's some fascinating sort of you know, ties to this in terms of like job satisfaction. I know for me personally, when my team is really comfortable with each other, when it comes to design, we are more effective in terms of giving folks critiques of their work in a constructive way that people aren't taking it personal, because we've established that trust, right? You know, even from a one-on-one perspective, if I'm able to really start to understand where my designer is, how their life is playing into their representation at work, I can more effectively help facilitate opportunities that really kind of drive and lean into that their passion, right? Because I understand that your goals in life may not necessarily be with me as your manager or at this company long term, right? So how can I really help you become your best self long term? And so I have a quote here from Vanessa Bout from the Harvard Business Review, and she says, being true to oneself empowers individuals in the workplace, facilitating feelings of control and mastery, which then lead to greater job satisfaction and happiness. This is a crucial point, because a sense of empowerment is essential to job satisfaction and engagement. And so what goes on after this, there was a survey that was done that looked at how long it would take for someone to feel authentic at work. And it took about 2 to 3 months in terms of 72% of the folks that were actually, that were polled, right? So 2 to 3 months. 2 to 3 months at a new job with new people can feel like an eternity. And the fact that we're not able to pass each other in the hallway organically can make it feel even more lonely, right? And so we're going to kind of go into some of these things to feel more authentic. And I think the best thing you can do off the bat in those first 6 months is to meet as many people as you can. All right. The second piece is not to be afraid to ask any questions. And third piece, can't say this enough, take notes. I would probably ask, are any of you guys taking notes? You guys can put that in the chat. But I think on the digital sort of front, we tend to lose sight of taking notes, right? So that's a practice that you'll really want to be purposeful with, especially early on, because you're really just kind of putting the pieces together, right? So even what you write today, it might not make sense tomorrow. But I've been in so many situations where maybe 3, 6 months down the line, there's an aha moment. Let me look at my notes, and really it helps kind of facilitate those conversations as well, right? So this all plays in each other. So again, how do you build these strong relationships, right? Again, it's different at every single company, but one of the things that I really try to do is work, or that I would recommend is work with your manager. I would probably say your manager is extremely important early on. You know, if you're in meetings and you have questions that you want to ask, you know, save those for your manager, right? If you don't feel comfortable. You know, one of the first things that I would recommend on the first day is ask, you know, recommend like, who should I get in contact with? We actually, on our team, we have rolling coffee hours. And so on a weekly basis, once a week at least, our designers actually rotate in terms of who they're meeting. And that's to sort of keep engaging that community and that connection, to feel more at home, right? A lot of our interactions socially are at the workplace. So again, it's sort of on that online medium. So we're gonna have to improvise a little bit. And this one's important. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I'm sure everyone has had a different version of onboarding where they're at. And I know for me, one of the things that I started to do was, 3 months in, I would actually ask my direct reports what could have been better during the onboarding process. And at first, I'm pretty shocked, because I'm like, okay, so you went 3 months without actually having a conversation about this until I prompted you. And a lot of times it can create a lot of anxiety, right? If you sort of put that in there, or if you put that pressure on yourself. Exercising the practice of asking questions and humility is going to be so important for you. I think a lot of folks get into, the mode of being super performative, but it's really okay if you don't know everything. I think most people understand that about you, and asking those questions again too allows you, especially in meeting settings, to also have a presence, right? So you don't always have to be submitting ideas to grow your presence within an organization. Obviously, that's something that should come a little bit later, but in your first 3 months, ask away. And this is also where the taking notes piece comes into play. So obviously you've asked that question. When it's coming in, take those notes, and also be really, really, really unorganized, or organized, don't be unorganized. There's tons of amazing note apps out there. Google Docs is huge for us. And so you can even share your notes, comment on those, really be open to being immersive around your learning experience here in these first 6 months. So we're only halfway through the year. So what are things that we can focus on that piece? So we've kind of taken that first 6 months of really starting to get to know your coworkers, right? Really start to take advantage of building that knowledge base. I think in this second half of the year, I think it's really good to start to understand your customer base and your user base, right? Most sort of applications are a marketplace, so you really can't have a successful application without users and buyers, right? And so understand what are both sides of it. Like what are the business sort of motivations, and then also kind of how are people using it, right? I think experience is super important. And I actually was having a conversation around storytelling and research and working with cross-functional teams. And one of the things that I really like to hit home is everyone who's working for a company has a contractual obligation to their customers, right? To their users. And so grounding yourself in that truth is going to be so important for you, all right? And so how do you get involved? Tons of different ways, right? It can be looking at or working with your support team. It can be working with your customer success team. If you have a user research team, really engaging with them for past projects, right? It doesn't need to be anything net new. But again, this is, sort of a little bit of bringing in that knowledge base, so you can actually, in your second year, in your third year, have more in-depth conversations that are starting to build versus sort of gaining clarity and understanding. And I think this piece, understanding what drives meaningful success for your team, this is actually very important as well. So we know sort of where the business side lies, right? We know that we want to build great tools for our customers, but I think especially early on when you're starting to work on projects and you're starting to figure out the scope of work, really kind of sit down and understand like what does the success of this product look like? That will help bring more clarity and focus to your team versus going on and building a ton of stuff that actually may not matter. because I think prioritization is really key, right? We can start to prioritize your work, gives you more time to focus. And in that, you're going to be able to deliver the best work that you can, right? And that you can be proud of. So we've gotten through that first year, and there's a lot there, right? But again, don't put too much weight on your shoulders here. We like to call it drinking out of a water hose, right? There's just a ton of information download. So really just be receptive to that, be organized, and really start to engage in those connections, right? Organically, you'll be able to get background from your coworkers, your peers, and then additionally, some of these artifacts that you're looking into. So once we get into year 2, as I mentioned before, you're starting to understand where you can have an impact. And so that'll be sort of some of the topics that we'll kind of speak to here. All right. And so this is really working with your manager. So mapping out what career growth could look like for you over the next year. Sorry, the typo there. Start having your discussions with your manager in terms of what your strengths and opportunities are. These are super, super important. And then this last piece is focusing on storytelling. So now we're starting to think about how we can, look at career growth, and then how can we be more effective with our cross-functional groups. So one of the things I think is really important when we have conversations about getting a new gig, a lot of folks are really stuck on just getting in the door, right? But the real question is what happens after you get in the door. I would actually say before you even start getting into the job search process, really kind of look at, a 2-year plan for yourself, right? What are the types of products and services and spaces that you want to work in? Okay. What are the ones that really pique your interest? What are the types of roles that you want to, have in those different industries, right? Ideally, where could you see yourself in 2 years, right? Are you in a mid role? Are you in a senior role? Are you looking to get into management? All right. And then from there, take those 2 years and go backwards, right? So the reason that I like to do that is that you're setting a goal for yourself. Now, in these next 2 years, it may not manifest itself in the way that you planned it. However, it helps it helps with discovery, right? You'll be taking one step in front of the other, right? And after a while, who knows how far you will have gone. And so really kind of start from that 2-year point, understand what that looks like, and really kind of work your way back. I think that's an exercise you all can actually do right after this call, okay? Now, if you can imagine that you're a year in and you've done that work, you can now have a more pointed and focused conversation with your manager to sort of think about how they can help facilitate that journey for you, okay? There's really not enough content out there in terms of how you as an IC can really work with your manager to make those sort of things happen, right? I think in the case that you might be freelancing and you don't have a direct manager in that case, I think this is still important, right? If you're thinking about it from a 2-year perspective, maybe it's how many deals you want to close, how much revenue do you want to bring in, are there processes that you want to improve to help you be more effective? These are important, right? Because they all really start to tie together. And you'll be in a situation again where you'll be more proactive versus reactive. And this is also another piece. Like, I start having conversation with your manager around your strengths and opportunities. And again, like I really want to frame this as that this is also an exercise that you can do yourself, right? So I think it's good to have a level of introspection and self-awareness. And so really kind of think about, like, if you're going through a product development lifecycle, right? That's from an early phase to, discovery phase to research, to prototyping, design, to execution, engineering, analysis and performance. Like, which of those areas do you feel very comfortable in? And where you not feel comfortable in? Like, I don't like to say weaknesses, right? I call weaknesses, in some cases, I reframe that as opportunities, because you have an opportunity to improve that, right? And so I like to really focus on those opportunity pieces. And then when it comes to your strengths, really ask yourself, why do you think you're strong in those areas, right? Everything is an opportunity in that sense, but I think having more clarity around areas that you want to improve on, again, will allow you to have more pointed conversations, right? If you don't have a manager, remember how we were talking about engaging with the community? Those are great opportunities to ask these types of questions and start to develop that bank to get different perspectives and build some idea of where you kind of lay in that spectrum. All right. So again, these are really practical and applicable things that you can do tomorrow. Just take the time to do that. And on the last piece here, I'm not going to go into this too in depth. I think this could actually be a presentation within itself. But focus on being a better storyteller. I didn't really go over this a little bit when we were going over the job piece, but when you're actually applying for a job, what do you do on your interview? You're telling a story, right? You're telling a story about yourself. And additionally, you're telling a story about your case study. What makes that story more effective is a lot of things that we actually mentioned here, right? So understanding your customers, understanding what drives the business. And then third is the why behind your decision-making process, right? And so I think if you can really start to add those three things together, you'll be a more effective storyteller. Now, what will be important is also understanding who the audience is. So your audiences are going to vary throughout your career. You may be in a room full of engineers, you're an engineer yourself, so you can go a little bit more in depth with the jargon. However, let's say if you were meeting with your VPs, you may not necessarily go as in depth with that jargon, right? And so really understand what stories are really going to engage your audience, given sort of the leveling that they're at. Now, this isn't something that you are going to master on day one, right? And I would probably say that storytelling will likely shift based on your organization, your peer group, et cetera. And so you really want to experiment with that. I think the more organized and prepared and the why and understanding the growth piece will give you more confidence in terms of being. And with that, that's where your charisma will really come through. But we're getting away from a lot of the hyperbole and imaginative things here, and really grounding it in that truth. All right. So hopefully that helps. I think these are super important for you to really kind of get to that next level. And even in rough times like these, you're always going to have an idea of focus in terms of what the next step is, right? It may take you a little bit longer to get there, but understand that, again, the journey just doesn't happen right away, right? It's about the process. And, before you know it, you'll be at that senior level role, at that managerial role that, we spoke about earlier when we were talking about this. So I'm going to wrap up here. Hopefully these tips will help you, help you in your career, and you can apply those tomorrow. I hope you all took a ton of notes. More than happy to follow up on social media as well. And then also I'll be presenting this Thursday as well in terms of how you can create a more effective case study and portfolio. So you can connect with me here on LinkedIn. I have a QR code on the right where you can just scan on your phone and we can connect there. I'm HMWHEELE on Twitter. And then you can check out my podcast on gettechnical.io. So that wraps up the presentation. Let's open up the floor for questions.
Thank you. That was great. Do we see any, I don't see any questions currently. Do you folks have any questions for us, for Harrison? Because I have a couple questions, but let the audience start first. Feel free to put it right in the chat or in the Q&A box, folks. So one of the questions that I had for you had mentioned this, something I've talked about and thought about for a while now, but do you have any recommendations for getting a mentor or finding mentorship opportunities?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think LinkedIn is a great place. I know I'm plugging where I work, but that has been an amazing community to really engage in. So there's two ways, right? So for one, I think your organic reach on LinkedIn is amazing, and so if you're not an active content contributor, and it doesn't mean you have to write articles, you can just write simple posts or share things. That's a great place to start, because you can start to engage folks in conversations there. And then additionally, there's a lot of online communities. So speaking from a design perspective, I think there have been a few mentorship circles around like ADP lists and design buddies that have communities of more than, I think, collectively 13,000 designers from around the world, right? And so, you know, I think there's so many ops there to kind of get involved. And there's also a lot of managers and designers that are opening up one-on-one office hours. So start to engage on LinkedIn, Twitter, you know, follow like design hashtags, lots of great opportunities to start engaging with folks.
Awesome. And then we had a question come in about a junior UI UX. I'm not sure exactly what your question is, Andy, but I think that Harrison could probably give you some really great tips of being a junior UI UX designer.
Yeah, yeah. So I get this question quite a bit, right? And around, you know, how can I get a job as a, you know, a junior UX designer? And right now the market is extremely competitive. And you know, I think one of the things that I think is going to be important for you is just always be ready for when the opportunity comes. I think a lot of companies have frozen hiring, or not hiring, or have done layoffs, and so, you know, there's not as many opportunities, but the market will be fine later on, and there will be opportunities down the line. There's tons of freelance opportunities as well. So, you know, I would probably say just make sure that your case study, your portfolio, I can search you on the web, make sure those core things are done. And that, again, with some of these pointers that I went over today, make sure that you're really communicating the why, and really, you know, really sort of expressing yourself through that portfolio the best way that you can through that storytelling piece.
Great question. Thank you. So any other questions from the folks on here today? Vicki was talking about how she doesn't think about too much about the future, more focusing on everyday tasks. So I guess that's a struggle itself as well. You know, you're really focused on your day to day, and then before you know it, a year's gone by. And do you have any advice or tips for trying to think about the future for your career?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have to make time for it. You know, I think when you don't make time for it, you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be reactive, right? And so you're going to have to make time for it. I can't stress that enough. Like, even for my team, we have a ton of projects that our project managers want our team to do, and I just have to say no. So really be ruthless in terms of how you manage your time. Say no to certain things, because you don't want to be in a situation too where you're stressed out personally. As I mentioned before, now that we're working remotely, you know, and we're working from home, you know, those stresses that we have in our outside life as well as in the work life, those are all going to come together. And so, you know, you really need to sort of say, okay, if I want to prioritize my life and my career, I'm going to have to say no to a few things, or at least sort of postpone them. So really kind of organize in that sense. Okay. I don't think it needs to be anything super elaborate. Even if you are just writing, you know, notes in Google Docs or on Apple Notes, that's a great place to start, but you just need to get in the thought process of doing it.
Great tips. We have a couple more questions come in. Are you able to see them?
Yes, I do. Okay. So is it too late for a designer over 35 years to start going into UX design? Is there any real life example? I don't think it's too late, right? I work with a wide range of folks on the age gamut. You know, I think again, when it comes down to design and understanding fundamentals, like those things will never change, right? Obviously our mediums are going to change over time. Our tools are going to change over time. So for instance, like I think when I started out, folks were using Photoshop, then they were using Illustrator, then Sketch came around, then we were using InVision, and now folks are going into Figma, right? So these things are always going to happen. It's not too late. But I think understanding the fundamentals, how you can apply them, are going to be important, right? It's the same content that anyone that's 19 and 35 can learn. So don't let the age be a factor in terms of how you're bringing yourself into the industry. I think there's a ton of opportunity. All right, so Fajar, when you're recruiting your team member, what is the qualification you're looking for from candidates, especially for a gig related to work, remote work, and not on site? So look, I mean, right now everyone is working remotely. Unfortunately, LinkedIn doesn't really hire a ton of folks on a remote perspective, so I can't really comment on that. However, again, I want to stress out, like what I've been kind of speaking of. I think a lot of those qualities that I was speaking to before, if you can really communicate those things in a way that's super clear, concise, and focused, that's going to help you be a standout candidate for whatever role, right? And so I think on your question here, if you're looking for more remote work, as I was talking about sort of like that 2-year kind of plan and looking at the types of companies that pique your interest, you know, I would probably maybe tick the box that are allowing for remote work, right? And so then that way you'll be a lot more effective versus kind of going into a situation and saying, hey, can you mold me in a remote conversation? You know, work at companies that actually already have a very remote culture to begin with.
Great questions, guys. I have one more question
Yeah.
specifically for you. So at Tapcoder, most of us work remotely already. You know, I don't even have an office to go to. So share how you personally have dealt with the remote culture and not being able to see your team, and any tips that you could provide for other folks. That'd be great.
Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, so I said my team was all remote when I first, but before we kind of went into, you know, our shelter in place, I have a team in San Francisco, I have a team in New York. And so I actually was not necessarily seeing my team members all the time in person physically. And then also when I was working at Base, our engineering team was located in Poland. So I had about 250 something coworkers that were in Poland. And so, you know, I think when you're working in technology, I think to have like a huge tech corporation shift online, it really wasn't a crazy transition, right? Even though we weren't really seeing folks in person, you know, we still had our meetings, we still had our virtual tools. And I would probably say, you know, even from a design perspective, the technology and the tools that we have to help us enable us to work, like your Slacks, like your Figmas and Miros, you know, those have really made the transition a lot easier. And so communication has shifted a bit. So being receptive to more asynchronous communication, being, you know, again, kind of having a start and end time to our work days and create expectations what people respect. I think those are things that are really important in as far as remote work goes. I will say, I think companies are thinking about remote work more and more, right? You started to see some of these larger companies like your Twitters and your Squares, you know, envision be open to the remote nature of work. And so I think what'll be important more than anything, and I want to frame this as, I think it's a little bit more difficult in the fact that we are working remotely during a pandemic, right? I think the during the pandemic piece is another level and another angle, because there's just a lot of stressors. And so it's going to be important to really, on top of thinking about work, thinking about how you can cut out time for yourself to really be in a good mental space as well. I think it's even more challenging since we don't have these in-person social interactions. And so, you know, we've been kind of doing, you know, within each month, like having our designers like take a break from that work. We really actually try to engage in more activities, even online as well. We actually just did a virtual escape room, which was pretty engaging. I mean, it's not the same thing as actually physically being there, but it's still an opportunity for us to really kind of relax a bit and have a conversation outside of work. So, you know, and I also want to say too, I'd probably say you work a lot more concentrated now, right? I mean, you're not really walking to a room. You're not waiting for somebody to get on a meeting, because all they need to do is click on a button and hop on Zoom. And so I think you need to sort of think about like how that all plays in, right? Because it's, you know, before we had sort of like this 8-hour work day, but now it's a concentrated 8-hour work day. So make sure that you're taking breaks throughout the day, and that your team is, and folks that you're working with are respecting that.